They said it came from the east, carried on trade winds and merchant ships. A shadow moving silently across continents. First, a fever that burned like fire beneath the skin. Then, the swellings. Painful lumps that grew in the neck, armpits, groin. Black spots spreading across flesh like ink on parchment. Death came within days, sometimes hours. They called it the Great Mortality before they understood what it truly was. Before they realized it would devour half the world. Some blamed the alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. Others claimed Jews had poisoned the wells. The desperate flagellated themselves in public squares, whips cutting flesh in penance for mankind's sins. But no prayer, no sacrifice, no medicine could stop what had begun. The whispers of isolated cases in distant ports soon transformed into a chorus of anguish sweeping across Europe. Blood-curdling screams pierced the darkness as wooden wheels creaked beneath the weight of the dead. Night after night, death carts wound through labyrinthine streets, piled so high with twisted corpses that limbs dangled lifelessly over the sides. "Bring out your dead," the hollow-eyed collectors called, their voices devoid of hope. The stench became overwhelming, a thick, putrid miasma that seeped into stone walls and lingered in clothing, impossible to escape. Those still alive pulled herbs to their faces, desperate to filter the air, knowing they might be next. Fathers buried daughters, then wives buried husbands. Then no one remained to bury the last. In just 5 merciless years, from 1347 to 1352, the skeletal hand of death would claim nearly half of Europe's population. The living, utterly overwhelmed, abandoned sacred burial traditions as mass graves became gaping wounds in the earth. Priests refused last rites, fleeing from the doomed. Children wandered orphaned through empty villages. The meticulously constructed hierarchy of medieval society, a social order that had endured for centuries, unraveled violently like a tapestry pulled apart by unseen hands. This was no ordinary disease. This was the Black Death, the most catastrophic biological event in human history. A demographic collapse so profound that its economic and social aftershocks would shatter the very foundations of European civilization and rebuild them anew. Before the plague arrived on European shores, a delicate balance had been struck between those who owned land and those who worked it. For centuries, the feudal system had defined life across Europe, a rigid hierarchy where peasants, bound to the soil through obligations and custom, toiled on estates owned by nobles and the church. Land was wealth. Land was power. And those without it lived in a state of hereditary servitude known as serfdom. But all of this was about to change in ways no one could have imagined. The disease first appeared in Europe when Genoese trading ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina in October 1347. Sailors aboard were already dying from an illness they had contracted while trading along the Black Sea. Within days, the mysterious disease spread through the port city. By January 1348, it had reached Marseille in France and the ports of Tunis in North Africa. Within a year, the plague had established footholds in Spain, France, and England. By 1351, the invisible killer had swept through Russia. No corner of Europe was spared. The symptoms were horrifying, and death typically came within days. Giovanni Boccaccio, the Italian writer who survived the plague, described it vividly in his work, The Decameron. In men and women alike, it first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumors in the groin or armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg. From the two said parts of the body, this deadly gavocciolo soon began to propagate and spread itself in all directions indifferently, after which the form of the malady began to change, black spots or livid making their appearance in many cases on the arm or the thigh or elsewhere. Medieval physicians, armed only with the medical knowledge of the time, were helpless against what we now know to be Yersinia pestis, the bacterium carried by fleas on rats. They believed the disease spread through miasma, poisonous vapors, or as divine punishment for humanity's sins. Some blamed astrological misalignments, while others sought scapegoats among religious minorities, particularly Jewish communities, leading to horrific pogroms across Europe. In Strasbourg alone, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in February 1349, accused of poisoning wells, a tragic reminder of how fear can twist into hatred when rational explanations fail. The mortality rates were staggering. In Florence, 60% of the population died. Paris lost half its inhabitants. In England, nearly 40% of the population perished between 1348 and 1350. Entire villages were abandoned as survivors fled to seek safety elsewhere. The clergy, exposed through their duties to comfort the sick and dying, were particularly hard hit. In the Diocese of Norwich, England, over 800 parishes lost their priests to the plague, nearly two-thirds of the clergy. The monastic orders, living in close quarters that facilitated transmission, sometimes saw mortality rates of 60 to 70%. The immediate economic impact was catastrophic. Trade collapsed as cities quarantined themselves and commerce ground to a halt. Artisans and merchants died by the thousands, taking specialized skills with them to the grave. Agricultural production plummeted as fields lay fallow without workers to tend them. Prices for basic goods soared, while land values plummeted. The dead no longer needed property, and the living were too few to work at all. In England, land that had leased for 14 shillings an acre before the plague could be had for just 6 shillings by 1350. But from this devastation emerged a profound economic transformation. As the plague receded, those peasants who had survived found themselves in an entirely new position. For the first time in generations, their labor had become scarce, and therefore valuable. The basic laws of supply and demand, though not yet formalized as economic theory, began working inexorably in their favor. Consider the situation across Europe by 1351. With fields lying fallow and harvests threatened, landowners grew desperate for workers. Peasants, suddenly aware of their leverage, began demanding wages instead of providing obligatory labor services. Many abandoned their ancestral holdings to seek better opportunities elsewhere, something unthinkable before the plague. In England, wages for agricultural workers rose by 50% between 1349 and 1350 alone. Similar patterns emerged across Europe, from Catalonia to the German states. The response from the landowning classes and royal authorities was swift but ultimately futile. In England, King Edward III issued the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, followed by the more comprehensive Statute of Labourers in 1351. These laws attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict workers' mobility. As the statute declared, "Every man and woman of our realm of England, not living by trade nor exercising any craft, shall be bound to serve, for the wages accustomed to be given in the places where they owe their service, and none shall depart from that service without reasonable cause or license." Similar legislation appeared across Europe. The King of Castile issued the Ordenamiento de Menestrales in 1351. In France, King John II promulgated the Ordinance of Labourers in 1351. These laws shared a common purpose: to preserve the economic order that had benefited landowners for centuries. Yet enforcement proved nearly impossible in a world transformed by demographic collapse. Peasants simply voted with their feet, moving to locations where they could command higher wages or better conditions. The laborers had another powerful ally: reality itself. As the chronicler Henry Knighton observed, "The laborers were so lifted up and obstinate that they would not listen to the king's command. If anyone wished to hire them, he had to give them what they wanted, and either lose his fruit and crops, or satisfy the lofty and covetous wishes of the workmen."
Do you like to dig deeper? Political economy is full of powerful ideas. You're right in the thick of it. Insightful, thought-provoking, expanding every step of the way. From Adam Smith, and the rise of capitalism to Marx's bold critique, mercantilism, Keynesian economics, neoliberalism, and more, where we explore it all, clearly and from every angle. Keep the momentum going. Check the links, dive deeper, and subscribe for more.
By 1370, just 2 decades after the first wave of plague, real wages for English peasants had doubled. Similar patterns emerged across Western Europe. This newfound economic power translated directly into improved living standards. Archaeological evidence reveals that peasant diets improved markedly after the Black Death. Consumption of meat and dairy products increased, while dependency on basic grains decreased. In England, per capita consumption of meat and dairy may have reached levels not seen again until the modern era. The plague had another profound effect. It accelerated the decline of serfdom across Western Europe. This institution, which had bound peasants to the land and required them to provide unpaid labor service to their lords, could not survive in an environment where labor was scarce. Lords who insisted on traditional rights found their manors deserted as serfs fled to regions offering better terms. Many landowners, facing economic ruin, pragmatically converted labor obligations into money rents and relaxed restrictions on peasant mobility. This transformation did not occur uniformly across Europe, however. In England and Western Europe, serfdom largely disappeared by the early 16th century. In contrast, Eastern Europe saw what historians call the Second Serfdom, a tightening rather than loosening of peasant obligations. Polish, Russian, and other Eastern European nobles, facing the same labor shortages, responded by using their political power to legally bind peasants ever more tightly to the land. The divergence would have profound consequences for the economic development of the two regions in subsequent centuries. The plague's impact extended beyond rural economies. In urban centers, guilds lost many skilled members, creating opportunities for survivors and newcomers alike. Women, in particular, found expanded economic roles as the shortage of male workers opened previously closed occupations. In cities like London, York, and Norwich, records show women working as brewers, tailors, and even in skilled trades like goldsmithing that had previously excluded them. Though these gains would prove temporary as gender restrictions gradually reasserted themselves, they demonstrate how thoroughly the catastrophe disrupted established patterns. The repeated waves of plague, for the disease would return periodically throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, forced innovation in land use. With labor scarce and expensive, landowners adapted by shifting from labor-intensive grain production to sheep raising, which required fewer workers. England's famous wool industry expanded dramatically in this period, laying foundations for its later commercial prominence. In parts of France and the Low Countries, intensive horticultural practices emerged to maximize output from smaller plots with fewer workers. The demographic collapse also accelerated technological innovation. Labor-saving devices became more valuable when workers commanded premium wages. Watermills, windmills, and improved plows spread more widely after the plague than before. Though no technological revolution occurred overnight, the economic incentives shifted decidedly in favor of mechanization where possible. Perhaps most significantly, the Black Death helped create the conditions for the eventual transition from feudalism to capitalism. By breaking the bonds of serfdom and creating a more mobile workforce compensated increasingly through wages rather than bound by hereditary obligation, the plague's aftermath established critical prerequisites for later economic developments. The rise of cash transactions over in-kind payments and labor services stimulated markets and monetary economies. As historian David Herlihy noted, the Black Death established a new equilibrium between population and resources, particularly land, that proved favorable to the survivors. The plague's long shadow extended even to patterns of landholding. With fewer heirs to divide properties among, surviving families often consolidated larger holdings. In parts of Italy and France, this concentration facilitated the later development of more efficient agricultural enterprises. Meanwhile, the church and monasteries, hit hard by the deaths of clergy, found their extensive landholdings difficult to manage directly, leading to new leasing arrangements that gave tenants greater autonomy and incentives for productivity. The plague's economic consequences intertwined with political and cultural transformations as well. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, though ultimately suppressed, demonstrated the new consciousness among rural workers who demanded not just better economic terms, but recognition of their dignity. When Adam Delved and Eve Spann, who was then the gentleman, asked the rebel priest John Ball, challenging the very ideological foundations of the medieval social hierarchy. The Black Death also shifted the balance between church and secular society. With so many priests dead and questions raised about why God had permitted such suffering, religious authority never fully recovered its pre-plague position. This subtle shift helped prepare the ground for the later religious reformations of the 16th century. Meanwhile, secular literature and art began exploring new themes, including a greater focus on the experiences of ordinary people exemplified by works like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, composed in the decades following the plague. Even architectural styles reflected the plague's economic impact. The ornate Gothic cathedrals that had characterized the high medieval period, built with abundant pre-plague labor, gave way to simpler designs as labor costs soared. By the early 15th century, the scale and ambition of ecclesiastical building projects had diminished noticeably across Europe. The plague's economic legacy extended well beyond the medieval period. Some economic historians argue that the post-plague labor market conditions in Western Europe created incentives for the development of labor-saving technologies and capital-intensive production methods that ultimately facilitated the Industrial Revolution. The divergence between Eastern and Western Europe in responses to the plague, with the West moving toward free labor and the East toward intensified serfdom, may help explain their different economic trajectories in subsequent centuries. What seems clear is that the Black Death, through its devastating demographic impact, fundamentally altered the relationship between labor and land across Europe. By dramatically reducing population, it inadvertently shifted economic power toward workers and away from landowners, creating conditions that would gradually transform medieval economic structures. The plague did not single-handedly end feudalism, but it delivered a shock to the system from which the old order never fully recovered. As we reflect on this catastrophic pandemic nearly 7 centuries later, we find a powerful reminder of how deeply interconnected demographic, economic, and social structures truly are. The Black Death reveals how a biological event can reshape fundamental economic relationships in ways that outlast the immediate crisis by centuries. When half the workers vanished, the survivors found their labor suddenly, unexpectedly valuable. And with that shift, the first cracks appeared in a social and economic order that had persisted for hundreds of years. From mass graves emerged not just grief, but the first tentative steps toward economic modernization. The Black Death, in its terrible way, demonstrated that even the most entrenched systems contain the seeds of their own transformation. Workers gained leverage, land found new uses, and society itself began a slow evolution toward arrangements that would eventually give rise to the modern economic world. Through devastation came change, unwanted, unplanned, but ultimately unstoppable.
We've got some amazing content coming your way. Subscribe now so you're first in line for fresh insights and all the good stuff you won't want to miss.